Hi Year 9 and welcome to this week's challenge. Still the theme of sense of place nature and still looking at flower forms much as we did last week with Carl Blossfeldt, but this time we're moving into the space. So even just on the first image you can see on the screen today, rather than looking at the flower from afar as we would do if we were Blossfeldt, we've actually moved right into the centre of the flower. We can see really, really beautiful tonalities, qualities of light, luminescence, and there's no space for us to move away from that form. We are within the space that the form occupies. And it's a photograph by probably one of the best loved photographers of the whole of photographic history, and that is Imogen Cunningham. You can see from her birth and death dates the lifespan she had. She lived to be a really old lady. And in her lifetime, she never stopped photographing. In fact, she's very similar to Picasso in terms of her longevity, not just as a human, but as an artist. And also in terms of the actual time in which she lived. She lived through periods of enormous social change, obviously 2 world wars, all kinds of kind of extraordinary things were happening in that part of the 20th century. And she photographed really from being a girl. She grew up in Washington State on the west coast of America. And I think she was 17 when she ordered her first camera, her actual own camera. She had a very understanding and sympathetic family. And again, putting that into context a bit, we're looking at a woman who lived at a time when perhaps women weren't supposed to really do anything other than raise children, get married. Here she was buying her first mail order camera. She had to wait many weeks for it to arrive, and as soon as it did, she took it out its box, and from that moment apparently never stopped photographing, even when she got to be a really, really old lady. She's famous for her portrait work and also a lot of still life work, and it's the still life work I'm going to show you because it's of natural forms. And you can see on the screen there a kind of descriptor of how she works, which is about sharp focus rendition of simple subjects. And that was the credo actually of all the collected visual artists who belonged to the same kind of grouping that she affiliated herself with in particularly the 20s and 30s, and they were called Aperture 64 or F64. In terms of sharp focus, we really can see everything very clearly in these images. As with the first slide, she's moved us into the space with that succulent on the far side, for example. And it's okay that maybe we don't know exactly what it is. It's still rather beautiful. The qualities of light, the sense of texture. And then in the middle image, where I think we're looking at some kind of, again, succulent or palm-like plant or flower structure, the contrast between the light and dark gives the form an incredible dimensionality. It's full of presence, even though again we might not be exactly sure what it is. You can see her there with one of her cameras. She used a Rolleiflex camera for a lot of her career. We have one in the department at school. If you ever want to see what she actually shot on, a very similar camera. What that meant is that when she was shooting, she wasn't holding a camera up in front of her face like that, but she was looking down into a lens, kind of like a periscope. But it meant then she felt as if she could get really into the space that the form she was photographing occupied. She was meant to be quite cantankerous. She didn't take any nonsense from anyone, apparently. She was married for a short time to a fellow artist. It didn't last long. Not only were they not suited to each other, but I think there was quite a lot of competition in their relationship between each of them for who was the most successful. She was very successful and very sought after in her lifetime as a photographer. In fact, when we think about her with other famous artists, she was often tasked with very well-known magazines to go and photograph other photographers. That's how good she was. And again, just to put that into perspective, if you are a photographer, one of the most daunting things is to share your photography with others who are renowned for that craft. So for example, she photographed Ansel Adams, She also photographed a lot of other people who are relatively obscure and unknown just because she thought they were beautiful. Anyway, she does obsessively look, and I think for all of us as photographers, that's something maybe for us to take away. This insistence on what things are like, what they look like. And going back to something that Picasso said, not just seeing with the eye, but seeing with the heart. Now, I don't know why, for example, she particularly wanted to photograph calla lilies. That's the kind of flower that are in these images. But when I look at them, I can see a photographer who really enjoyed them, the way they looked. She found them extraordinary. Even though, we could walk along the street today and maybe see some growing in somebody's garden. She looks at them in tonal quality. She looks at them as shapes. She sees them as subtle and shifting forms over time. So I don't think for a second that she photographed the same lilies over a period of a year. Obviously, they would just die back. But she returned to similar kinds of plants and flowers many times, like the succulents, for example. So there's something in those shapes. And actually, I could say here that these shapes are quite architectural in many ways. So even though we don't have sharp right angles or particularly linear qualities, we do have something that has a lot of pleasing and aesthetically subtle shape shifts. So we're looking at spirals, for example. We're looking at intersections of light and dark, but also intersecting shapes. The difference with Blossfeld is, as I mentioned already, this notion that we move into the space of the object or the flower, the plant, for us, looking at nature, and taking away parts of the frame. Even also when she is framing or removing the frame, she's creating a context by doing that. Funnily enough, she's not giving us lots of illustration around the outside, but we do get a sense that we've entered something special with the photographer looking at these flowers. So this week, what I'm going to ask you to do is to create a PowerPoint of your images again. I do want you to do a bit of research, and this is exactly what you're going to do. You're going to analyse 2 or more of Imogen Cunningham's photographs of plants or flowers. I want you to use key vocabulary to explore her work, and I want you to put writing on every slide. Now, for those of you whose work I've seen from last week, absolutely beautiful things to produce, and lots of you are writing really eloquently about the work you can see in front of you, and that key vocabulary is important. So I'm looking for words like frame, composition, contrast, exposure, anything that you would think of as a photography word. I want you to create a series of photographs with a minimum of 4 images, again absolutely perfect, in which you obsessively look at the flower or plant form, whatever that might be. I'm not saying you have to go and photograph a rose. You might want to photograph simply a leaf on a plant. You can use a variety or mixture of any of the following elements. So that would be dark backgrounds, zoomed in format, stark shadows, high contrast, and heightened texture. And as usual, if we were in class, I would be demonstrating how I would go about doing this. And the first shot, of course, is my very unglamorous setup shot. This is how I would set it up. So I had my black fabric in place. I just used daylight. I was shooting in daylight, but I also amped up the light or lighting conditions to create quite stark shadows by having an additional light source. So no fancy lighting, it's just a bedside table lamp. And I had a fern from my windowsill. I photographed only on my phone, so I'm not using my big fancy camera, anything at all. But what I did do is I made sure I really got in close to the space. And if you are shooting on your phone, don't forget that on your phone screens, of course, when you push the screen, the point you push at is the point that the meter will read the light and also will focus. So I managed the contrast, I thought about the brightness and also the colour temperature. So even though I'm photographing in black and white, the colour temperature is still important to me. And if you adjust that in a post-production setting, you'll be able to see that if something that otherwise in colour is green, if you adjust colour temperature, even if it's in black and white, you get a variety or a variation in the quality of density of tone. So I chose 2 images. I had an assistant. I asked my daughter to hold the lamp without its shade on. Actually, I took the shade off so I could get really hard light on the fern leaves. And I zoomed in the second image of the 2 in black and white there. I think that's my favourite, and the reason is because the black space behind helps to create the contrast with texture, not just about tone. So the fern itself is actually quite spiky along its edge. And actually, funnily enough, I hadn't even realised that so much just looking at it myself, owning ferns, owning lots of plants around the house. And it went to show me something about people like Imogen Cunningham, and also, of course, Karl Blosfeld, is that through spending time with their subjects, even though their subjects happen to be plants and flowers, they got to know them really well, and they drew attention to things that are extraordinarily beautiful, even though they are so ordinary. Now, again, thinking back to what lots of you did last week and how brilliant your work has been, I know lots of you emailed me and I gave you some stretch and challenge stuff to do. This week's stretch and challenge is this. I want you to experiment with contrasting flower and plant forms within the same frame. So where, for example, I shot just the fern, if I was to do this, I'd have my fern and maybe I would use my big cheese plant leaves. And I would contrast the 2 in the same frame. And that's to show obviously differences in textures and shapes that you can create. All very simple. Again, you don't need anything fancy. If you don't have plants at home, don't worry. If you don't have dried flowers or flowers lying around, don't worry. You can go outside and, of course, being respectful to nature, you could pick something. Don't pick wildflowers, please, but you could pick a leaf up off the ground. You could do anything at all. This doesn't have to cost any money. It really is simple. So going back to our task, you're going to create a PowerPoint of your images with a little bit of research this week into Imogen Cunningham. You're going to analyse 2 or more of her images of plants and flowers using key vocabulary to explore her work. And of course, writing on every slide. That includes, can I add, your analysis of your own work. I want you to create a series of photographs, a minimum of 4 perfect shots, in which you obsessively look at the flower or plant form using a variety of dark backgrounds, zoomed in formats, dark shadows, high contrast and heightened texture. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what you're going to do. Your work so far has been absolutely beautiful. You should feel really proud of what you've achieved. Well done everyone, and I really look forward to seeing it next time.